Before I start in, I wanted to get just briefly a sense of you and kind of where you're coming from. How many of you are speech-language pathologists? Please raise your hand high. So a group of 3 of you. How many of you are regular ed teachers in whatever environment that you're in? Raise your hand high. So happy that you are here as well. How many of you would consider yourselves sort of special educators where you have, I don't know, moderate special needs or some variant of that cluster? Who got left out? Everyone get a chance to, please, how would you characterize? School psychologists, excellent. How many administrators, school psychologists as well? Administrator, yeah, how many school administrators here? Great, good to have you guys here as well. So last kind of cluster of questions, how many of you have been teaching or working with kids for 0 to 3 years? Raise your hand high. Great to have you here. 4 to 7 years. And I guess the rest are more than 7 years, right? So we have various levels of experience. Some folks are a lot more primed with very recent, much more recent academic backgrounds, and others are very primed with just years of experience. So we're going to be patient with one another and make sure that we're all sort of moving along together. Let me know if you feel like I'm going too quickly or too slowly. I'll do some check-ins around that. I don't like to bore people by going too slowly, but at the same time, nothing is accomplished by rushing through material. So this is where I am. I'm in Charlestown Navy Yard. Have any of you ever seen the USS Constitution yourselves? Kind of a, 7 or 8 of you. Well, we have the building immediately to the side of that, of the Constitution, is one of our institute buildings, and I'm in still another one that used to be a joinery where they would make the kind of ribs for old wooden sailing vessels when Charlestown Navy Yard was truly a Navy Yard. The key points that you guys can relate to, that this group can relate to, is that, and it will reveal my perspective, and that is that my colleague Pamela Hook and I developed a curriculum that thinks about language as being both oral and written language, and that they're intimately commingled developmentally, and that will be one of the sort of foci here. And so students have the option of getting dual teacher certification in speech language and in reading and writing and literacy with a unitary curriculum. So I don't think of, oh, you're the speech language person, you only work on speech correction stuff. I'm thinking of speech language pathologists who've been adequately trained as being at the table with reading and writing specialists. And classroom teachers, if you've been well trained, you've got a background where you understand language development and you've got some basic information about relationships between oral and written language. So key disclosure, and it's really patently obvious, I'm an author of From Talking to Writing. It just came out this year, and I get royalties, not a lot of them, but royalties from the book, and I also get paid to speak in a lot of different places. My presentation today is going to focus a lot on linking semantic feature analysis with sentence expansion strategies. We'll demonstrate how you take theme-centered language and exploit it, multiple theme-centered vocabulary and concepts, and sort of recycle it at different linguistic levels with a lot of emphasis on personal sequence narrative and then something that I thought I was the person who invented the term micro-discourse. I thought, wow, I'm very clever. I invented this. It's these 2 or 3 sentence units of text and looking at cohesion across them. And then I found out some Iranian researcher had used that same term around the same period of time to characterize the same type of stuff that I'm interested in, but this micro-discourse. And then you'll get to briefly look at sort of application to expository text. So I'm gonna, even though there's some theory behind what I'm talking about, I wanna talk a lot about practical methods and techniques. Does that seem like a reasonable approach? We will get a little bit of kind of background model, but then we're gonna dive in to move from the 30,000 foot level right down to where we're skimming over treetops, and hopefully you'll leave with some ideas that even for those of you who are sort of veterans, hopefully you'll walk out with a slightly different perspective on how you approach the work that you do. If you look at sort of the frequently encountered approaches to teaching writing, folks generally understand the value of activating prior knowledge. How many of you employ that before you have your students write or express themselves verbally? Classic methodology, good old Vygotskian approach. You're going to activate prior knowledge, then you're going to add new material. Another approach, they're not exclusive, they may be used simultaneously, is the use of graphic organizers or templates. As you know, graphic organizers are these sort of visual depictions of strategies or kind of frameworks or strategies that will guide students' writing of text. So some of you may use an organizer like this for personal narratives. So here's the story summary: what happened, when did it happen, where did it happen, who was there, and then beginning, middle, and end. So that's a basic visual organizer for information. How many of you use those with students? That type of thing for, say, a narrative. Okay. And then here's the classic hamburger, for the expository paragraph. Is that familiar? How many of you have actually used this sort of hamburger idea, where you got your topic sentence, supporting sentences, and then a concluding sentence? Nice visual image. For those of you who are vegetarians, pretend that it's tofu, but that's the main idea. So there are pros and cons to graphic organizers, as you know. One of the reasons that we all use them is that they're pretty good at supporting kids' planning and executive functioning. It actually removes some of the load on them for planning, and they can devote cognitive resources towards formulation. The other piece, and it's closely related, is that they aid students with self-regulation. So an impulsive student will remember, oh, I haven't provided any details here, or I forgot to put in the topic sentence, and they kind of scaffolds them around that executive functioning. But there's a problem, and that's where we all come in, and that's where we need to be prepared to really give students the kind of support that they need. We know that activation of prior knowledge, couple it with graphic organizers, that it is going to help a lot of students with language learning difficulties, but it still is not sufficient for the children with, I'll call it moderate to severe language learning problems. So I'm going to let you experience and reflect on just a basic language formulation task. This is my son, Brad. It's fun because I get to come all the way to Cleveland and be with my son at the same time. It doesn't get a whole lot better than that. He is now chief of Reuters in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and he speaks 3 languages fluently. And he has a wonderful wife, and I'm going to be a grandpa in about 3 months. So let's get back to why we were here. Right? But I'm occasionally allowed to be distracted, right? Okay. So I'd like you to formulate a declarative sentence. That means you're not going to be asking a question. It's a declarative sentence about the picture. And I'd like you to begin it with the word when. All right. I'd like a volunteer to read their sentence. And by the way, I'm going to do something that may feel a little bit, a pinch on the sort of infantile side, but it's something that's really important to do with students. After the person finishes their sentence, we're going to applaud them regardless of their sentence, okay?
When Brad was in Brazil, he spent time in the mountains.
Excellent. So right away, even for you as adults, I imagine that when you heard that I was going to be asking some of you to read your sentences, even when you're very linguistically adept, there is still a kind of performance tension. So you imagine how our students with language learning difficulties feel. It's sort of like, oh my gosh. And you can see kids like burying their head under the table and so on. The applause says this is a safe place to experiment. And then you can provide sort of corrective feedback, additional information. And I gave you no information about the location at all. You had a visual stimulus, and that was as viable a sentence as any if one doesn't already know where that is. So another sentence, please.
When Brad was visiting this site, he was overwhelmed with the complexity of the ruins.
Thank you. One more. One more volunteer. You know, you're not going to have very many more opportunities to do this, Lou, so we're giving this to you.
I love Mike's. When I saw that picture of Brad in Peru, I decided Del and I are going to visit Machu Picchu.
Here we go. Thank you. So, in order to perform this task, what knowledge and/or skills did you need to draw on? Okay, so let's do a little bit of kind of round robin. I know that you probably have a list of items that your table identified. Just give one for each group. So let's start here.
You have to use the word when as part of a phrase versus a question word.
Interesting. So you need to know that when you're using when in some kind of a statement, that there's a certain way that it gets used. So that's some kind of knowledge, some kind of background knowledge about that use of that. Go ahead. Actually, for those of you who just turned and talked, make sure you identify the person who's going to report for your group. I apologize, I should have had you do that. So who would like to?
Organization.
Organization of what?
Words, phrases.
Okay, so there's some kind of knowledge about how words get organized into sentences, into clauses and to sentences. By the way, what type of sentence is this? Is it simple or is it complex? Complex, so you have a front embedded clause in it, and it places a very heavy load on what kind of memory? Verbal working memory. So we know that kids with language learning difficulties just historically have massive difficulties with phonological working memory, that's holding speech information in the mind, as well as this sort of verbal working memory with real words, not just, isolated speech sounds. What did you come up with as another requirement?
the knowledge of what a declarative sentence is, we had to perhaps go back and think, oh dear, I have to do this.
Yeah.
What exactly is it? And
Grammar
do I
101.
remember right? Right.
Excellent, good. What other kind of knowledge did the person, you need to have to do that?
We talked about a couple of those, but then also just the punctuation part of it.
Okay, so this was a writing task. I could have asked you to formulate it orally, in which case you'd need to have in your mind the idea of a sentence starting and a sentence ending. That's actually what punctuation reflects. All it is it's physically and visually representing a sort of initiation, ending, and in a sense capturing, if it's a comma, components of sentence prosody. So some people think of written language as just being this stuff on the page, but in fact, it's really representing spoken language. It may have a slightly different style, certain conventions, but it's representing spoken language. Other information you needed to have.
So we actually both wrote from the perspective of more like a caption. So like when I travel or when I, so from I guess Brad's perspective, so we said it may be helpful to have an understanding of how to write from Barry's perspective so that you could write as Brad or about Brad.
Very neat. So there's a certain amount of perspective taking when we write. Some of you may have been really kind of documenting what you were seeing, and some of you were maybe taking the perspective of Brad himself in providing a sentence. What kind of linguistic information did you have to have besides sentence structure?
Maybe this was said, but to know that it's not a question, it's a sentence, a declarative sentence.
Yep, and so that's a syntactic or sentence-related piece of knowledge. In order to formulate your sentence, what other components of language came into play?
You have to translate what you're seeing
Into
written language.
Yeah, into written language, and you needed to be coming up with vocabulary to describe what you were seeing, vocabulary that was appropriate. So vocabulary was a kind of key component as well. So you talked about written language conventions, sentence structure, vocabulary, and also this idea of needing to exercise executive functioning around executing on the sentence. That's what I would sort of lay on to that manipulation of words in sentences. So we could go on and on. There's a lot to a task like that. By the way, I believe that if you learn the logic of sentences, because sentences are syntax, order of words, but there's also logic embedded. When, da-da-da-da-da, there's a logic in that. It's telling you something that's going to be happening or will be happening in time. So it's, if I have you produce a sentence that has a because in the middle, there's a logic to that. So I would argue very strongly that knowledge of sentence logic has to be mastered. Logic at the sentence level has to be mastered before you can expect students to do, say, persuasive arguments at the discourse or text level. They can't make sentences with because first. We have no business asking them to write, say, expository paragraphs. Or if we want them to do a comparison contrast paragraph, I would maintain that they need to be able to write sentences with words like although, or however, or both, so that you're talking about similarities, okay? All right. So we're going to move back to the 30,000 foot level The oxygen's going to be a bit rarefied, so pull down your oxygen mask for about a minute right now. My colleague Pamela Hook devised this chart here to guide our students in diagnosing and providing intervention for students with language difficulties. The top of the chart, this part here, deals with word identification and spelling, processes involved in that. The bottom of the chart deals with underlying language skills. We're not here for me to talk about dyslexia. I'd love to talk about dyslexia. I could talk about it all day long with you, or multisensory structured decoding, encoding strategies, or strategies to aid automaticity at the word level or fluency at the text level. Really what I want to talk with you about today is this comprehension, expression, strategies for helping kids with morphology, meaningful parts of words, but in particular syntax, semantics, and that will all take care of issues with discourse and pragmatics. By the way, everything happens within a larger context, a social context, and that's what these factors are here. And as you guys noted, and we talked about, language involves executive functioning and memory. Good teaching provides support for executive functioning and verbal working memory. If you don't provide support for those, most students will fail or at least produce language that isn't adequate. So are we guilty of dysteachia, where we're not teaching the way we need to? That's the big question. When I have a student who's failing, I self-reflect and I go, what do I need to be doing differently? So we're going to focus on this bottom of the chart, the red part, and then some of this side of the chart. How do you support attention, executive functioning, memory? So the air's kind of thin, right? Let's move it down a little. So at the Great Language Feast, when we set the table, we need to identify priorities, because these kids are really struggling, at least the kids that I know who struggle with language and learning. They're having a great deal of difficulty. And it's sort of like, oh my gosh, where do I begin with this kid? So if we're going to set a table for people to eat, we want to think, okay, what's the main course that this kid needs? What's an important side dish? What's another important side dish? And if you look at predictors of listening comprehension and expression, these factors, I've represented them in size, are all important predictors of the ability to comprehend what you hear or to express. So what's the main tray at the language feast? Vocabulary, absolutely. Another important tray is sentence development. And a still other one is sort of discourse structure. Like, what's the structure of an expository paragraph? It's got a topic sentence, it's got some details, it's got a conclusion. That's important, but it's, in terms of order of priority, it's less important than these other factors. So let's talk about sort of strategies for methods for developing underlying vocabulary and sentence skills. We're going to make sure and use strategy instruction, because strategies, the child can own a strategy and it helps them with supporting their attention, working memory, and executive functioning. We want to make sure we're kind of at the principles level. We want to make sure that we're incorporating listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and that we're exploiting cross-modal associations for kids. You still with me? Yeah. I know we're still up at pretty high altitude right now, and you're probably sort of going, come on, I want the good stuff. But I think having this focus behind us helps us understand why we do what we do. And when what we do doesn't work, we can go back to these models and use them to help us think, did I incorporate speaking and listening when I was teaching? Or was I just giving kids worksheets and having them quietly, they're really behaving. They're being very quiet. They're kind of executing on the sheets. Or when I'm having them employ speaking, am I doing it in a systematic way where the speaking that they're doing is informing their underlying language? Or am I just kind of engaging in a kind of freewheeling discussion around a topic? All right, so we're going to do some word level strategies. And I wanted to emphasize the extraordinary importance of doing theme-centered instruction. Too often, people invent these activities or tasks that kids are supposed to do, and the sentences are semantically unrelated. One sentence is about farmers. The next sentence is about cosmetics. Just unrelated sentences. And in general, that is not a useful approach. If we do a thematic approach, it will allow us to keep using key vocabulary again and again so that children internalize that vocabulary. So, I'm not going to have you do the study now because our time is somewhat limited. But if we did a study together where I gave you list number 1, I showed it on the screen for 10 seconds, and then I took the list away and I said, write down every word that you can remember. Imagine that you're in a study like that. And then I give you another list number 2, and I show it for 10 seconds, then it disappears, and then you write down from memory. From which list do you suppose that most participants recall the most words? Absolutely. I mean, I had you primed for that one. But sometimes people actually do better with list number 1, and when I ask them, I often discover that they're very linguistically adept. They're very facile with language, and they make up these kind of crazy or zany stories that really make it stick in memory for them. They're typically not people who struggle with language learning who do that. So lots and lots of studies have supported the importance of themes or thematic or topical material for the kind of reduction of memory load that it creates. It really frees more cognitive energy, and also you're getting to reuse these theme-centered nouns. You want to make sure and use multimodal resources to provide kids with vocabulary. It's not bad to show kids short videos if they're very focused and the content is relevant to your theme. You can draw out key vocabulary from those. Reading materials, of course. Pictures, interesting pictures. Pictures that have an implicit story in them are extremely useful. Pictures of isolated objects, in general, are less useful. Depends on the level of the student, of course, but it's when there's an implied story that the picture can be very powerful. And then, of course, manipulatives. So I remember once when I was working with and for Lou, I was keeping bees, and I brought in a smoker, a bee smoker. Of course, it was not lit at the time, but it smelled of smoky. I brought in honeycomb from my bees, and I had bees in a large jar so they could see these live bees flying around in the jar. And the amount of language that I got from that around this theme of beekeeping, and the larger topic was living on a farm and so on. It was amazing. So I thought I'd bring in a theme that is maybe of interest to adults in the room. Many of you I know are art lovers or you appreciate art. Can anyone remember who the artist is here? Absolutely, Winslow Homer. And the title of this is called Breezing Up. He used to live up near Prouds Neck in Maine, sort of northern New England. It's a very beautiful area, and this was an image probably from around 1890s, maybe, of some teenagers out in a boat. So when we give a picture, this has an implied story. You can imagine a story you might write about this. But when we give a picture like this, we want to make sure and guide students' visual analysis. Some students tend to pick irrelevant details. Does that sound familiar? For those of you who've done some of this naming, they'll pick like, ooh, that's a really weird looking blob in the lower left-hand corner of the, or maybe they'll talk about some minor element in the picture. So guiding their analysis, this sort of triangle idea, you start at the top of the picture, look down, see what's in the middle, and then bring their focus down to the bottom. That's very useful. When I was a young SLP, cocky as a bullfinch, just absolutely confident that I really had everything figured out, which I've long since discovered I do not. Lou came in and watched me with a group of kind of rough and tumble teenagers from this place called Medford, which is, north of Boston. And they were all, I was talking to them, lots of talking. And they were all over the place. They were elbowing each other, they were making jokes, they were crawling underneath the table. You know how it is when you're first in with trying to learn to do group management? And he said, Charlie, you may want to give them a picture to focus their attention. And as soon as I started bringing in pictures, manipulatives, and so on, it was like night and day in terms of focusing students' attention. So then we engage in order to get this vocabulary that we're going to be using, we engage them in the kind of classic priming of the word pump, so to speak. So we have them call out maybe key nouns and or verbs. And here are examples of the sort of words that at least the students that I used to work with there or work with at the Institute of Health Professions, they'd come up with these super high frequency words. And then I would add these kinds of words, very specific topic-centered words. So activation of prior knowledge, we talked about it before, then adding new vocabulary. Activation of prior knowledge is like creating mental Velcro so that the new, more specific words, you can imagine they have hooks on them. When you give them to them, the hooks come in and kind of latch into that Velcro, so to speak, so that words will stick in memory. Okay, we good? A little bit faster? Yeah. Okay, all right. So now I want to share with you a set of strategies that I've actually been working on over the last 3 or 4 years, and that is I kind of rediscovered semantic feature analysis. I mean, it's been around since the 80s, but I want to remind you first of what it is, and then show you how it really relates in important ways to sentence development. So let's say our key noun is rudder. You want to come up with these kind of specific component meanings that are associated with rudder. So what we store words semantically by these different categories in our brains. So semantic features, we're not making them up. They're in our brains, and it's how we organize information semantically. So if you looked at like composition, well, a rudder is, in this case, it's made of oak. It's part of a boat. Where is it located? In the stern. It steers the boat. What if the word was fork? Just, fork that you eat with. What's it made of? Maybe steel or plastic. What category of thing is it? It's a, where's it located? Could be in the kitchen, on the dinner table. What is its function? Kind of spears food or picks it up for you, okay? So the neat thing about semantic features is they also define contrasts. So I hope your brain is going ahead and you're thinking comparison, contrast, paragraph. I was in talking with the group this morning, I recalled a classroom here where I looked at, they were teaching the Act 4 of Romeo and Juliet. So Montagues and Capulets. What are shared semantic features? What are distinct semantic features? So it can go to any level of student. So it can define similarities in this case, versus, and also the contrasts. So here's classic structured semantic mapping. How many of you have done this with your students? A couple of people. This is a very powerful method. If children are extremely shy and reluctant, let them do free mapping, where they just come up with random associations. But once they're ready, you got them engaged, then you can move to structured mapping like this, where they're mapping semantic features. So I want to show you how this stuff relates to this stuff. How semantic features can inform sentence development. Sound like a plan? Okay. So it's going to basically prepare students for sentence development. So if you only remember one thing from today, I'd be really happy if you just remembered this and you then tried it in your classrooms, then you emailed me about your experiences trying it. But here we have these semantic features. So we picked the word rudder. Here's a captain, that's the agent who uses it, what its function is. It steers the boat. Composition, oak with brass hinges, and then the location is in the stern or the rear of the boat. So here are examples of sentences from easy to hard that demonstrate why semantic feature knowledge is so amazingly powerful and important. So the first sentence, the captain steered the boat. So here we go, captain steered the boat. Amazing, isn't it? Just feeds right into it. Here's a more complicated sentence. The captain steered the rudder in the stern of the boat. And then here is a fairly complex sentence. Standing in the stern of the boat, the captain steered the massive oak rudder. Are you with me there? Okay, so the vocabulary work with semantic features can be directly exploited. You also want to teach with a sentence hierarchy, and you're starting to recycle key vocabulary into whatever level of sentence the student is ready to engage in. So in this case, teenager steered would be the simple noun verb. It's like a core kernel sentence, noun verb. And then adding a where phrase, adding a when phrase. Here's an adjective. Here's adjective, noun, verb, where or when at the bottom. So the work with Dee Tyak in San Francisco, she and some of their colleagues had come from Stanford to San Francisco State. And I thought, wow, this is great. I can get a master's degree, pay $1,000 for the entire master's degree, and study with people from Stanford University in San Francisco. I felt like I had died and gone to heaven. And so we were mapping young children's acquisition of sentence patterns. And this is just the first page. There's a couple other pages moving into more complex sentence patterns or sort of parts of the sequence. So this is it. You move to the level that the student is ready to do. Once they've mastered that, you move to the next level. You make sure they can do it in listening, speaking, reading, and writing modalities. You'll need to adjust to level of severity of dyslexia with that, but that's the general idea. So let's say there's an optional article, a and the, right? An adjective, noun, verb, where, when. So that's the kind of sentence, we're at that level of sentence with our students. We've worked from noun plus verb, to noun plus verb plus where, noun, verb, when, adjective, noun. You know, we've worked our way up through that hierarchy, and here is where they are. So I'm making it a little harder so that you'll be interested in the activity. So I've moved up to that level. Here's a way to teach monitoring using these very simple names, and we're using these letters to signify them. So if you have trouble decoding, all you remember is the N is the noun, or the V is the verb. I'm not having you write out the word predicate or words like that. So I'd like you to look, what I do is I put the target sentence on the board, and then you can provide the student with sentences either orally or in writing, and they either listen or read the sentence, and they determine whether it's correct. Does it reflect this pattern? Or if it's incorrect. If it's correct, they just put a C. It's not a spelling test. They just put C. If it's incorrect, they put X, and they just put a line and they put maybe the when is missing or the noun is missing or whatever. So why don't you guys do the first sentence? We'll do the first sentence together. 3 gulls screeched at dusk. The article is optional. You know, you can include that. So 3 gulls screeched at dusk. Does that correspond to the target sentence I've written up on the board? No. So what do you put? X dash, what's missing? Where? Excellent. So I'm going to, and you want to do it with immediate feedback because you're teaching, you're not testing. So right away you do it as a group. You ask students what the answer is. They tell you, and you say, excellent. Please explain to me what the adjective is, what the noun is, what the verb is in that sentence.
So, free is the adjective, it's the noun describer. Gulls is the noun. Screech is the verb. At dusk is when. Where.
Excellent. Now can you make a sentence that adds a where phrase to that same sentence? Go ahead.
3 gulls screeched on the beach at night.
All right. So learning is largely social, unless we're an autodidact. It's largely social. It's an important place where students learn to take risks. If a student makes a mistake, you want to create an environment in which they are supported and so on. So are we good with that? We got it? And it goes, you got other examples of sentences. You can also do it as a production task. You can do it orally or in writing. Do I need to take the time to have you actually do this to experience it? Who would like to try it? Okay, you can try it on your own, but you got the idea. It can be an oral activity. If you have a small group, you can have maybe 6 or 7 nouns represented here. And for each sentence, you put the initials of the child's name. You act as transcriber. If a child makes a mistake, you just check with the other students and say, is that correct? And someone will say no. And you'll say, well, why do you think it's not correct? And they can provide the part that's missing or whatever the correction is. but you want to make sure it's a socially supportive environment. If students are critiquing, they might say, you know, I like your sentence, but you left out the where phrase. Kind of classic way of giving, you know, the sandwich technique of providing feedback. We good? Yeah. Personal sequence narrative, as you know, is in its most basic form is a personal account of something that someone did, and it provides a sort of sequence of events. The first part of what I'm talking about will be very familiar to the vast majority of you. I'm under no impression that this is new information for you, but I want to show you how you can take this PSN idea and sort of turbocharge it or enliven it with detail strategies. So it's the PSN, it's basically got an introductory sentence that includes that I or we voice, the event, where and when, and then these kind of classic transition words that when we were at Landmark, we thought we had sort of discovered them and very quickly realized that teachers across the United States were trying to vary the sort of signal words. And then an optional concluding remark that kind of gets at the overall feeling after you had done the event. So what's important is the PSN is a really useful springboard. The reason I'm emphasizing it is that all of us recount things to each other after we did them. It's a very natural activity to engage in, and therefore it's very accessible to kids. And you can use it as your vehicle for teaching elaboration strategies and cohesion strategies. So I'll show you, how many of you are working with very young children, like kindergarten, preschool, first grade? So here's an example of how you might approach a pre-literate seventh grader, family history of dyslexia. First, you're going to have them do a sort of three-part PSN, just 3 parts. So for the first part, they memorize this Gestalt word first. They draw their picture of the initial event. And then for the second part, they'll use the word then, and they'll draw the picture of the event. And then the third part is going to be last. You see the colors? Remember Linnea Aries' work on sort of orthographic Gestalt recognition? So you have first, then, last. Green, yellow, red. Whole word recognition. You're teaching kids how to decode over here, but right now you're just getting them to support their language. So the child does these pictures, they bring them in, the teacher says, okay, tell me about this. So the child says, first I get cookies. And the teacher responds, where do you get the cookies? And the student says, in the cafeteria. Now say the whole sentence. So this is a perfect environment in which it feels pretty natural to ask a student to engage in sentence expansion, so they're producing a longer sentence. Then functions very similarly. Then I meet my friends. Where do you meet your friends? In the lobby. Say the whole sentence. Then I meet my friends in the lobby. Student, last I wait for the class bell to ring. Where do you wait? At the foot of the stairs. Say the whole sentence. And sorry, I left out the word last. The word last should be in here. Last, I wait for the class bell to ring at the foot of the stairs. So that's a rudimentary PSN, or personal sequence narrative, and that oral language practice is providing a foundation for when they move to literate level. Here's a student who has slightly higher literacy skills, but really struggles with just getting words on the page. This weekend, I went with my family, and then they put in these pictures, and then they recount. So first, we rented ski boots, then we rented skis. Next, we went up the lift, and after that, we rode down. Finally, and I'm thinking that's like this ticket that you turn in to get your initial deposit back or something like that. In conclusion, it was a great time. So this is, again, using pictures, which are a real staple for most students with dyslexia. If they didn't have pictures or images, it would be often quite difficult for them. It's also good for kids on the spectrum who benefit from pictures to aid them with kind of leveraging what is often a really strong set of visual spatial skills. Here we're moving into the classic template that most of you probably use with your students. First, then next, after that, finally. Here are the 4 elements to incorporate into the topic sentence: when, who, where, what, where, and then indentation cues, so the student is writing their sentences. And then here's a kind of proofreading checklist. I'm kind of skeptical of proofreading checklists. I think, remember that reading activity you engaged in earlier where you were identifying the part of the sentence that was missing and so on? That is proofreading. If kids can do that, they can do most of the things that we give them checklists for. I'm not saying, don't say, I can't believe Dr. Haynes said that checklists are not useful. They're useful, but I think the more fundamental thing is that the child is monitoring for language structure, and that really aids them a lot. So let's read this together. This is a child's narrative. Let's go ahead, let's read it. Every morning, all in all. Okay. So this is classic sequential narrative. It adds that sort of conclusion feeling that you typically find in most narratives, some kind of sense of conclusion. So micro discourse, again, is sort of 2 and 3 sentence level chunks of information. Micro discourse also involves inter-sentence cohesion. So we'll come back to that same sequence narrative after I do the micro discourse. So don't just hang on, reserve closure for a little while. So we're going to talk about micro discourse, and then at the end we'll return to putting those together. So 2 elements that we emphasize are semantic cohesion, as well as this idea of a detail circle. You're going to hear me tell you that you're supposed to have students memorize something. Memorizing actually is not evil. Memorizing can be very helpful if it's a powerful strategy that they're memorizing that they can use to access. So here's a word level problem. There's a word level problem in this student's text. Think about at the semantic level or meaning level, kind of vocabulary level. What do you see that's obvious in this text? Think about vocabulary use. Is there a vocabulary word? I'll give you a hint. Is there a vocabulary word that's getting overused? Yeah, bears. So when I worked with Carol Prudding, Dee Tyak and I worked with Carol Prudding. She was at Santa Barbara at that time, UC Santa Barbara. We looked at effects of simplification of texts on comprehension. And we found that in texts where we had taken a proposition, that's basically an idea word within a text, a proposition. So the word bears is a proposition. It's basically an idea, and it recurs. There were actually multiple words that could be used for bears, but we just used the word bears. Again, and we thought, okay, this is going to simplify it because you're not using longer words, phrases. Students' comprehension actually went down with that text. They actually did better with texts where they didn't know all of the synonyms, but there were synonyms in there. And at first we thought it was a statistical error, that we had definitely fouled up our research. And we realized there's something about synonyms that involves semantic activation, therefore interest in the topic. So you want to make sure and teach students synonyms for key propositions or key ideas, key word ideas in the text. So a word that you know is going to recur multiple times. So if it was about the pirate Blackbeard, you might want to have the word pirate. What's another word for pirate? Misguided sailors, or, you know, I mean, you come up, I just made that up on the spot. You can tell it's very clever, you know. No, but you can come up with a number of synonyms, multi-word representations. So bears, here are examples of synonyms for bears. So you want to have students memorize this cohesion circle. If they're at this level where they're starting to write several sentences of text, have them memorize this cohesion circle. You got the original noun. The next time that proposition recurs, that idea recurs, it's got to have a synonym. Can't use the same word again. Then you got to use a pronoun for it. Then a synonym, and then the original word. Main idea is to get them varying word use. That's going to enliven their sentences. So, if grizzlies is a proposition, identify the times that proposition recurs or occurs again. This is called cohesion, the recurrence of this idea. And once you think you've identified all of them, raise your hand. So there's the word grizzlies, and it happens again multiple times in that same paragraph. Right? How many people found 3 or less times that it occurs? 4 or less? Any 5s in there? I think it's 4. Okay, let's look and see. Grizzlies, many grizzlies live inside Yellowstone Park. They, maybe you missed the pronoun they because it's easy. We use it so often that we forget that it's actually referring to something that went before. They are the largest of the bears found there. Tourists visiting Yellowstone is advised to stay at least 100 yards from these dangerous creatures. Every year they cause, okay? So I count 1, 2, 3, 4 times that it recurs after the initial. So that's much more interesting than just using the word bears. And the cohesion circle, memorizing it and writing it into the margin of the paper is very useful. Student has to be able to recall it from memory and write it down. And every time they do a passage until it's automatized, they write it in the margin. Okay, a common problem for writers is they lack strategies for adding details. Lou and I often would kind of engage in dark humor and talk about our students not being able to describe themselves out of a wet paper bag because they lack sort of ways of incorporating descriptive detail. So the detail circle is a strategy that's super useful. So here's the detail circle. Here are these, it's kind of ordered roughly in terms of order of difficulty. So relevant fact sentences, adjective sentences, sentences that tell the why of something, use of quotes, for instance, and then all the way up to humor. So here are these sort of easier, some people may include quotation in there, but this is for intermediate level PSN. So once students have the basic personal sequence narrative structure, first, then, next, after that, finally, that sort of litany that we are all familiar with, you introduce they're ready to move the intermediate level, and they memorize those first few parts of the detail circle, and they can just put it in the margin of their paper. So what do these look like, right? You're kind of, I can see you kind of going, okay, this sounds good. Give me some concrete examples. So when you're teaching this skill, you're having them, here's adding a fact detail. So the children rake the leaves in the yard. A fact, the kids rake them into a large heap. So instead of using the word children, they're using the word kids, remember? They're using and here they're using a pronoun for leaves. So both strategies, cohesion circle, and they're adding a fact detail. Now you're starting to see how these things come together for making coherent, more compelling writing. Here's another fact. The pile of leaves started to blow all over the yard. So now together in text, if you imagine these sentences flowing together in text, now you have an elaborated piece of text. So they can do their first, then, next, after that, finally, PSN, and then underneath each of the elements of the sequence, they're adding these detailed sentences. Then they can recopy into a paragraph. Here's an example of an adjective detail that's following this. The leaves were red, yellow, and pumpkin orange. I could spend a day talking about how to teach adjectives, but fruit words, candy words, vegetable words, those are all really useful for like turbocharging kids' writing and making it much more interesting. Here's an example of a why detail. Children raked the leaves in the yard because their father was going to pay them. My dad never paid me, but that's all right. So let's move up to more difficult stuff. Here's an example of adding a quotation. And students will sometimes have difficulty sort of prompting a quotation for themselves, so they may need to overlearn phrases like, one of them asked, or one of them said. They may have to overlearn those phrases, and then once they get automatic, then they'll start to be more inventive and creative. So one of them asked, how much longer do we have to do this? Similes are more difficult because you're having to get more abstract. You guys know this really well. So colorful leaves had been floating down into the yard for days. The red, orange, and yellow colors looked like. So that phrase, looked like, is super helpful for cueing similes. So together, those two sentences form a piece of micro discourse. They're small text chunks that you're going to see the child integrate first into this predictable PSN structure and then into expository. So here's a for instance sentence. This one is actually setting the child up for an enumerative paragraph, by the way. Remember I said sentence logic sets you up? So if you remember the enumerative paragraph for your listing. So family had many fall chores to finish to prepare for winter. For instance, and this puts a load on memory because they have to be thinking, what are things you do in the fall in New England or Ohio, for example? These are examples. Here's an if-then. It's a little bit like a because, but it's kind of adding conditionality. The self-prompt is, how did it make a difference? If the children raked the leaves in the yard, then they could go to the movies later. So what's the condition under which they could do that? Again, I did not get to go to the movies. Right? Humor is often very difficult for our students. Not always, but often. And therefore, we have to give them strategies for producing humor details. And let me share a couple of them. So here's your starter sentence. The kids had raked the leaves in the yard into a huge pile. It was funny when. So that's a good way to cue. Most students, even if they can't kind of make a funny joke, they can remember something that was funny. May not always be appropriate, but that's a whole other deal, okay? So it was funny when their golden retriever leapt into the gigantic pile and sank out of sight. Or another starter phrase that's helpful for them to overlearn is, they laughed as. They all laughed when, or they all laughed as. So cueing humor with those high, very predictable, they overlearn those phrases, and that helps them think of humor within their story, or add humor. So each of these unfortunately, you're looking at these and you're seeing them isolated as sentences, but you can imagine them all kind of flowing from one to the other. That's a piece of microdiscourse. So, detail circle. Once they've learned the basic PSN that all of us know we've used forever, then they they learn the cohesion circle. They do some good synonym work for whatever your key nouns or themes are. And then they memorize parts of the detail circle until they're automatic and they can recall them and put them in the margin of the paper. So now I want to show you how you kind of put them together into with the PSN. So here's the advanced, well, depending on which details you're using, it's either the intermediate level or advanced. But you can see the detail. So whatever the level of detail is the student is at, they're putting in those details after those elements. So that's the kind of layout of the worksheet. But I don't like referring to it as a worksheet because there's all this oral language work that you're doing that's preparing them for it. You don't want to just hand this to a child and have everyone be quiet. You want to do that systematic oral language work in conjunction with it. So let's look at an example of what it might look like. A child who's done a lot of work and now they're getting a chance to just, without any teacher monitoring, and you're going to see classic spelling errors that many of our dyslexic kids make. So let's read this together and I'll help out if you can't read it. So a Halloween celebration trick-or-treating. At dusk on Halloween night in 2008, my friend Evan and I went trick-or-treating in Evan's neighborhood. First, remember, that's your first element. So now you're getting to see it flowing together, not in a worksheet, but you're actually seeing it all pulled together. So let's, again, first, I got into my warm and fuzzy Santa costume. The Santa costume was a little big. Then I went trick-or-treating in my friend's neighborhood. Evan's neighborhood was the size of 7 of my neighborhoods put together. Next, little kids started chasing me. They chased me because they thought I was really Santa, and they were everywhere. And then he goes on to talk about them being like little devils and so on, chasing after me. But now you're getting to see how that basic PSN gets elaborated with these kind of descriptive elements. So you're with me so far? Good. So I'm not going to bother to recap because I sort of recapped verbally how it works. The kind of first chart, make sure they can do the basic PSN, and then you move on to expansion and elaboration. Here's a child went to the Topsfield Fair, oldest county fair in the United States. Here is one paragraph of her sequence narrative. I think it's like the after that. And then over to the right, it's kind of analyzed in terms of the kind of details. Okay, let's read this together. After that, we tried to get the wristbands. See, because you got these wristbands so people knew you had paid. After we got the wristbands, so we could go on the rides for $20. I walked up to the booth and asked for 1 wristband, please. The evil older woman just looked at me like I was crazy. She said, "We don't sell those anymore." I was so mad. Now I had to buy 20 tickets, which only got me on 4 rides. I thought that was a ripoff. I asked her, "Why don't you have them anymore?" She just said, "Next." That made me really mad. She gave me 20 tickets and I left the booth. So this was a student who had really struggled with language expression, but after 2 or 3 years, you can see the level of detail and sophistication around details that she was able to add to her PSN. So I'm going to just very quickly move up to paragraphs and essays. By the way, this sort of PSN structure fits right into sort of transition to expository, the process paragraph. So for example, here's a way of cueing a starter sentence for any process? Are there many steps for whatever? Are there many steps for making chocolate chip cookies? Are there many steps for repainting a house? Are there many steps, you name it, okay? For climbing the mountain, there were many steps for climbing the mountain. So now you need background knowledge through all those multimodal sources. Here's your first, then, next, after that. There were many steps for climbing the mountain. First, the mountain climbers packed their bags. Then they began the long trek into base camp. And the concluding sentence is a frame that they memorize. So performing, making, or doing whatever it is a complex process that results in whatever. So making chocolate chip cookies is very complex, but results in delicious things to eat, or delicious dessert. So whatever your topic is, you can frame the concluding sentence that way. And here it is with these details added. So there were many steps. Let's read this together. There were many steps for climbing the mountain. First, the mountain climbers packed their bags. Why or how? They needed to carry light, nutritious foods that would give them energy. Then they began the long trek into base camp. The trek into base camp improved their physical conditioning and prepared them for higher altitudes. So this is now moving into an expository environment. So we talked about importance of theme-centered vocabulary. Here our theme is mountain climbing or whatever. We talked about the importance of teaching students sentences. The logic of sentences can dictate the type of paragraphs that you're using. Then we talked about this kind of cohesion circle and a detail circle that students can memorize and use it within the framework of this PSN, this kind of very familiar sequence narrative, and now you're getting to see it exported into an expository environment. That's in an hour and a half. You just got to fly all over the place, from 30,000 feet down to skimming over the bushes. But you've gotten a good sense of how we can structure and scaffold memory and language to support students who really often struggle with executive functioning and self-regulation around their writing. Okay? Thank you very much.